aquaponic engineering and production from Cornell University and from the Grow House Aquaponics in Colorado. He's also a graduate from Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web School. He specializes in education of food production and soil health. He's the director of Georgic Development for the Monticello College in Utah, and he manages 2,500 acres of grasslands for the Ruby Mountain Foods Company, where the highest quality of grass-finished beef is raised. Over the COVID shutdowns, he built a solar greenhouse, which you are all invited to come and see tomorrow. He will be doing a tour from 11 to 1 out in Clover Valley. But that solar greenhouse feeds 20 people 80% of their food. I had the pleasure of taking a 3-day boot camp with William a couple of years ago and getting to know his mission statement and approach to food and soil biology, so it is my great pleasure to present to William and let you take it off.
Thank you, Dale. All right, can everybody hear me? Maybe. Okay, here we go. So, I have a different approach to gardening than a lot of people, to plants. So I'm going to go through this, and if it sounds like I am disagreeing with what other experts say, it's not really true. It's just that there's a lot of different ways to be successful. And what I've found over the years is that when we are doing certain projects, we learn more, and science progresses. And as we learn more, we find out that, yeah, maybe we were wrong in one context, but it worked when we were doing it so-called wrong. And now that we're doing it so-called right, it's still working. Maybe it's working better. So as science progresses, it's not that one person is doing it wrong and another is doing it right. We all need to be working together and collaborating and learning more. So, I mean, I loved Cody's presentation. It was fascinating and great. I will say some things that might sound like I'm disagreeing, but I'm not. Okay? So this is my book. I just got this done. That was my winter project. So I'm going to teach out of this book here. It's available on Amazon. I'm going to go into the soil health principles. So there are certain principles that you have to do. So these are the things that we do. These are the action word. And there are 7 of them. Different people have different principles. The soil health people used to say there were 5, and then they added a 6th one. When I wrote this book, I added in a 7th one, so I totally made it up. But I think it's a good contribution, and it is the idea of mindfulness. The opposite of mindfulness is worrying about the future or the past. Okay, I was on my farm, I was working, things were going a certain way, and then it went bad, and then I couldn't pay my bills at the end of the year because my crops failed. It could have been weather or whatever. And so that has caused me trauma, and every year now when I go out to plant and to harvest and do all my farming, I'm still plagued with that trauma of a year when I almost lost my farm. This is the story of the American farmer. But to be mindful is to forgive those things in the past, forget those traumatic things in the past. Get a counselor if you need one. There's no shame in that. Every human should have a counselor, especially if you're a counselor. There's a thing called counselors for counselors. I didn't know that till I studied psychology. But we need that kind of mental health. And it's sad because in the agricultural community, we don't get that help as much as we should. So mindfulness is the first soil health principle. We need to be focused on the thing at hand. When we walk out into the field, just look and see what's in the field. Don't be making your decision today, this year, on the traumatic experiences of the past, or worrying about what is going to happen in the future. Just let the land tell you what it's telling you. Be observant. If you have a compost pile, look at it and check the temperature. Don't be worried about, the last 5 I did failed. It's not going to help you with this one. So be mindful, be present in the moment. The second soil health principle is the idea of context, and that is make sure that you're doing the right thing with the right amount of tools. So if you're going to start a farm, so this is just an example of context. If you're going to start a farm, don't try to raise a crop of rice on top of the Sierra Nevada mountains. That would be out of context. Obviously nobody would do that because it's so absurd, but it's amazing how many out of context things that we do as farmers that we really shouldn't be doing. Let's do things that will actually work in our area. So that's one idea of context. There's many more, but we don't have time for that today. Number 3 is no-till or minimal tillage. Why don't we till? Why shouldn't we till? Is tillage bad? Is it wrong? Is it evil? Is it a sin? Is it, so tillage, oh man, I'm going to pull my hair out. I love tillage. How many of you have been in a 400 horsepower tractor with a 50-foot disc and you're just ripping through the field, man? It's addictive, okay? And it's nice, it's beautiful, and we think we're doing a good thing. So I'm a recovering tillage addict. That's the truth. And I didn't make that up. I heard another great guy say that, but it's true. It can become addictive. But why not till? What's the purpose? It's because one tillage pass can kill 50% of your beneficial fungus in the soil. And so, and it's one of the hardest beneficial organisms in the soil to build up high populations. So we want to focus on minimal tillage, all right? So that's one reason. There's a lot of other reasons too. But we're going to move on to the next principle. Keeping the ground covered, the idea of covering the ground with, I call it a detritus because it is the detritus sphere, but that just means compostable materials. So on large acreages, we would cover the ground with like a cover crop and we would roll it down. So nowadays it's a common thing, well, not super common, but it's becoming more common, and you can find the roller crimpers. And so you can buy a tractor that has a 3-point hitch on the front of it. I mean, how many of you have seen a tractor like that? There's not very many, but they're being made now. And you put the roller crimper on the front, and then you still pull your planter on the back, either a grain drill or a planter, either one. And so in one pass across the field, we are rolling down the cover crop to get that detritus sphere there, and then we're planting right behind it. So this is saving fuel, it's saving labor, and you only need half the horsepower in the tractor, so you can have a lot less expensive machinery. The ground cover keeps the ground cool, so it doesn't get too hot and too cold. It feeds the microbes. It keeps the moisture in, and a whole bunch of other things. But those are the big ones. The next principle is the living root in the soil. You want to have living roots in the soil all the time. If you have a plant that is growing year-round, like 365 days a year, then it is making microbe food. So you're feeding the beneficial microbes every day of the year. Well, what about winter? Well, you still need to have those plants in the soil. It is still working. They are not pumping the carbon into the soil as quickly because they're not actively photosynthesizing, but it is still keeping the microbes alive. The next one is the animal impact. So when we have systems in the world, ecological systems, and we remove a large diversity of animals, the plant life suffers. And we can see this in the Great Plains. There's a lot of plant species. I should say grass species, specifically grass. And they're going extinct because of the lack of the bison herds that roamed there for who knows how long. We really don't know. Let's just say thousands of years to keep it simple. But since they're not there and they're not moving in those massive herds, there are grass species dying. They're just going extinct. But nobody cares about the grass. So we don't hear about it on the media, right? I care about them, but it's not a big world problem. I think it should be a big world problem, but we don't hear about those things. The last soil health principle here is diversity. So there should be 7 there. Diversity is the idea of having your entire ecosystem working for you. You want the benefits of all organisms working together, okay? So I'm going to refer back to these during the rest of the time that I have here, but I'm going to move on just a little bit. So in shifting gears here, the number 1 farm expense right now in modern farming, I always tend to say American farming, but it's really modern farming in any country, and that is fertilizer. A few short years ago, it was fuel was the basic expense, and before that it was labor. But these have changed rankings. Right now, fertilizer is the number 1 expense, fuel is the number 2 expense, labor is the number 3, and then equipment cost is number 4. So we can significantly lower every one of these categories by using compost, proper compost, not rotten organic matter, because that will introduce disease and pests. So if you're going to make a compost, you need to know how to make it properly. And then we take the compost and we introduce the organisms, the microorganisms that grow in the compost. We put those on the land, and then they do the magic on the land that they've been doing for who knows how long, let's say millions of years, to make the soil function. So it's all about soil function. That is the key. We want the soil to function properly. When we look at some of the massive old growth forests in the world, that's when we find the most productive soils anywhere. So let's just think of the redwoods. They're the biggest plants on earth, and if you go up there and you measure out 1 acre of land and you count how many calories that soil is producing to keep those massive plants alive, what you find is that that soil is producing more calories per acre than anywhere in the world, including man-made agriculture, okay? So by calories, I mean energy. So if we went to an acre of redwoods and we're in the forest, there's no calories there that equal human food. I mean, there probably are, but not the way that our healthy Americans like to, what we call food. But, so how does it do it? How does that ecosystem create those massive amounts of calories, and how does it translate into the most productive energy that's being created? And we really don't know, but we have a good idea. The reason I say we don't know is every so often a scientist publishes a cool article, and we're learning more and more about what fungus is doing, what the protozoa is doing, what the beneficial bacteria are doing, and the microarthropods and the incatraids and all these little guys that are in the soil that are making the soil function. So as we learn more about that, then we can take our knowledge and we can implement what we learn, and we can put it into our soils in our own garden, on our own grasslands, in our own fields. And by mimicking what Mother Nature is doing, then we don't have to worry about the common problems that we have been worrying about in agriculture for a long time. Like, how much fertilizer do I need? How much calcium do I need in my soil? What is my pH going to be? How many weeds am I going to have to fight this year? All of these things become problems of a past generation and a reductionist science way of thinking that we don't need to worry about anymore. We just mimic Mother Nature, and if we mimic her properly in our own soils, the soils begin to function, and we can kind of step back and do half the work and get the same result. Okay? So is this true? Who thinks I'm crazy? You can go ahead. Nobody dares to ever say that. I thought we had a hand, but it was the sunglasses being adjusted. Okay. So we have massive bills to pay when you're a modern farmer. Fuel, tractors, fertilizer, labor. And if we pay those bills, we don't have any money left to take our kids to Disneyland. And so the American farm family has a different culture than other farm families. And the government says, well, we want to keep people on the land. We need a food supply. Let's give them a subsidy. That started in the World War II era when there were all these problems with, that whole Depression era. And then when things got better, they never quit paying the farmer. And so those subsidies have been around forever. But it still doesn't work. And we know it doesn't work when we go back and we look at the socioeconomic problems of the rural communities of the United States. So we have to fix the problem at the root and not just put Band-Aids on it with passing out welfare for farmers. But that is not what this talk is about today. Other than we can fix that problem and farmers do become profitable. That is the subject today. So I have an acquaintance in North Dakota, South Dakota area, and he farms 40,000 acres. His fertilizer bill used to be $500,000 a year, and he went down this soil health journey, and I think it was about 2 years ago, somewhere in that range, he used his last bit of fertilizer that year, and so over a 5-year period, he switched from normal agriculture into using the compost, growing the microbes, rolling down the cover crops, building soil structures, and his crop yields were a little bit less than using the commercial fertilizers, but he didn't have a $500,000 bill anymore, and most of that now was profit. And guess what he did with his family? He took them to Disneyland and he paid for it, and he doesn't take any more farm subsidy payments from the USDA. So that is a success story. That is what we want. All right, where should we go from here? Let's talk about how some of these things actually work. So how many of you guys have a garden? Let's get interactive just a little bit to wake everybody up. So most hands are raised. I see a couple of people who didn't raise their hand who I know have a garden. And how many of you keep it weed free? Okay. How many of you let weeds grow on purpose because it's good for the garden? There's a lot fewer hands, just for the record. Okay. For those of you who come to the greenhouse tomorrow, you will walk into a jungle. Now it's springtime, so the jungle isn't tall yet. But last year it was getting pretty tall with scary things in there, like weeds, Why would I let weeds grow in the garden? Here's why. And remember, this is all about compost today. Okay? Why do I let weeds grow in the garden? Number one, I can harvest them when they get big, and then I have something to compost. So that's not bad. But I manage weeds so they never go to seed. If one goes, and you'll come to the greenhouse tomorrow and see some things, you'll say, he told a lie, because this one's going to seed. I just haven't had time to get them all out. But I try to manage so that no weed species go to seed. All right? As soon as they do, and they're going to go to seed before those seeds are viable and will sprout, those are out and they're in the compost. Okay? Why else would I grow a weed in the garden? Because and this is a new thing. I mean, farmers have been doing this for thousands of years, but they didn't know they were doing it. So I'm going to tell you the coolest science. And this is like in the last decade we figured this out. If you let a minimum of 4 plant families grow together so that their roots are touching, so they're close enough together that the roots are touching, then the plants will, they put out all their exudates into the roots leak sugars and protein. So the exudates go out into the soil, and it grows a maximum number of beneficial microbes in the soil. And when you get lots of microbes, we're talking about upwards maybe 200, 250,000 species of different types of microbes, and then really high populations of each species. So when you get a really big amount of those microbes in the soil, then they will turn on genetics in the plant roots that give the plant disease resistance, pest resistance, exceptional flavors, your color intensity gets better, and a host of other things. All right? So I'll go a step deeper into that just for the science. Are there any science geeks in here? Okay, we have some hands, so I'll go ahead and do this. I'm safe. So in plants, you have primary metabolites, and then you have secondary metabolites. So a primary metabolite is easy to count. It's easy to quantify by science. So I can look in this room and we can count humans. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I can count them, unless there's an alien in here. But as far as I understand what I'm counting, then my science is going to say there are 25 or whatever humans in this room. So that is a quantifiable thing. So that would be a primary metabolite. So when you have a plant, you can weigh the plant. You can count yield per acre. So how many bushels we have. Those are quantifiable, countable things. Secondary metabolites are much harder to count, like disease resistance. Oh, I had a lot of disease resistance. How much? A lot. Okay, but how measure that? Well, if we're going to be scientific, let's measure it. And let's write it down and keep a record. Oh, it was a lot. Okay, but how much? Oh, tons! You know, you need a 10-year-old person in there to say, tons and tons and lots and truckfuls. I don't know. They're more creative than adults. But, so, how do you count and know the secondary metabolites? Well, it can be done, but it's harder to quantify it. It's harder to know. And so back to the people analogy, how much love is in this room? Oh, I love my wife a lot. I love my kids so much. And then the 8-year-old, you know, they would be saying, my dad's tougher than your dad. And, you know, and how do you know? Quantify that for me. Prove that, 8-year-old. So secondary metabolites are very hard to count, and that's the point I'm trying to make here. But what we do know is that when you have a maximum of microbes in that soil, like really high amounts, we start getting pest resistance, disease resistance. In the last presentation, he mentioned the Brix. You can do a Brix test, and it just shows how many sugars, proteins are in the plants. It's very easy to do with a $20 tool. Anybody can do it. And when those Brix levels are very high in your plant, there's a good likelihood your secondary metabolites are turned on. And if a pest species eats the plant material, some plants and some species then of the pest, sometimes the pest will die because the plant becomes toxic. So wouldn't that be cool if our plants were so healthy that they have their own disease or pest resistance built in, so the bugs won't even eat the plant? That's where we want to get to. But it's extremely hard. In fact, it might be impossible. I kind of think it is impossible, but I don't know. It's impossible to get to that level of nutrition in the plant if you have a monocrop. You've got to have 4 plant families growing together. So how in the world are we going to do that and feed the world, you know? If we believe that feeding the world has to happen with, you know, thousands of acres. And I probably lean toward that way of thinking, although I think there needs to be a backyard garden for every family that's feeding them a significant amount of food. So I kind of live in both worlds there. But we certainly have seen in our greenhouse, if you come tomorrow, you can walk around and you will see the little white cabbage looper, the imported cabbage moths, you know. There's different species in there. They're both bad because you get all the little green worms on the cabbages and broccolis and all the cole crops. And then the worms are eating holes in them, and it makes your food fine to eat, but you can't sell it. If you're at a farmer's market, nobody wants to buy things full of wormholes. So when you have those little green worms on there, And in our greenhouse, the species are there, but they're not really eating the cold crops. And when they do eat them, they're only eating the older leaves that are starting to die and decompose anyway. So I put this whole theory in this book, and I don't know how much science I have to back it up, but I was confident enough to publish it, saying that when you have your pest species present, and our observations and what I've seen for years, is that the pests are there, but their ecological role is to decompose unnatural phenomena that are found in Mother Nature. So old, dead, decaying things, the bacteria and fungus will eventually eat it, but it takes those bigger organisms like the insect world, your macroarthropods, to start chomping stuff down to smaller bits. And so that's my idea, and my belief is that those bigger bugs, their purpose is to start decomposing those. So if we're just thinking of that from an ecological point of view, and we forget agriculture for a minute, and we forget that we hate pests, and we're just observing, this goes back to the idea of mindfulness, then the observation tells us that a 200-acre field of whatever crop it is, if it's highly infested with any kind of a pest or disease, from an ecological point of view, something's drastically out of balance in that ecosystem, and it needs to be cleaned up. So Mother Nature did what it does to clean it up. Mother Nature, the ecology, the pests, didn't know that I needed to make $50,000 off of that crop to pay my bills. But I knew that. So now I have trauma, and I'm going to go get a whole arsenal of all kinds of sprays and this and that and the other to try to, save my crop. And that's what we tend to do, is to save crops. But the thing that we need to do is make the plant so healthy in the beginning that we don't have to solve the problems, because the problems never arise in the first place. So how in the world do you do that? You make compost. That's how you do that. Because when you make the compost, somehow magically all of the correct creatures will appear in there. You don't put them in there. They just appear if you make a good compost. So that kind of tells us that there's this kind of a crazy idea in the world that when it comes to microbiology, everything is everywhere. I guess it blows around in the air and it goes to the clouds, carry it, and raindrops. So something in the ecology is moving these creatures all over the place. So I guess that's how they get in there. But nobody really knows. There's papers that say, we found this and that, and there's links to it, but it takes a long time. We need more researchers to actually figure out some of these answers. So anyway, we make a good compost, and then we have a really high concentration. Once the compost is done, we have a high concentration of beneficial, and all these are beneficials. I'm not talking about bad guys anywhere. So we're going to have beneficial bacteria, fungus, protozoa, nematodes, microarthropods, and sometimes the microarthropods aren't in your compost, but as soon as you're using the compost, then they show up in the system. But I've had composts where I found them in there with my microscope, and there's a microarthropod. We were looking at a sample one day, and my daughter, I think she was like 17 at the time, and she's got her eyes in there, and she's buried in there, and she's moving the little thing so the slide's going around. And when you're in a microscope for a while, you start living on that slide, and your mind is in there, and you kind of forget that we're 1,000,000 times bigger or whatever. Actually 400 times, but it seems like 1,000,000. And so she's moving the slide, and all of a sudden she went, "Ah!" And it was about like that. And her eyes went from here, because she knew where it was, and then it went right down to the slide, and she was focused there. And now it's just a little tiny slide with a cover slip, and you can't really see anything. What she had ran into was a microarthropod, and it was coming right at her. So it can be pretty scary. And there was a lot of different kinds that looked different, but this one had It had 8 legs. It looked like a spider, but it was really fat and short legs. Yeah, it was cool. And so I grabbed my camera and said, "Look in there again." She goes, "I don't want to, Daddy." So it's pretty funny. But she did look in there and I got a picture. And so I show that sometimes when I have PowerPoint presentations. But so yeah, the world of compost is a beautiful thing. So what do these guys eat? It's important what they eat, because what they eat is what they, and then they poop, because if it's alive, it eats, and then if it eats, it poops, no matter what creature it is. And then the poop does something. So we've got, let me not get mixed up here. Okay, here we go. So bacteria are gonna eat the green leafy stuff. So when you're making a compost, have you ever heard of like getting different sections? So you get like 30% of green living plant material. And then you get 60% of brown old dead stuff like wood chips. And then you have 10 to 20% of a high nitrogen source. So the bacteria are gonna eat your high nitrogen source and they're gonna eat your green living component. And that's what the bacteria are eating. And then their bodies are made up of nitrate. And so when they poop, they're releasing nitrate. When they die, they release nitrate. When something else eats them, they release nitrates. And so it's this beautiful thing, because nitrate is a plant food that we need, you know. And that's one of our #1 expenses in agriculture is nitrogen. And obviously there's different forms of nitrogen, but bacteria are making lots of nitrogen. And so they're keeping that nitrogen cycle going. The other thing that bacteria do, I don't know if they eat it, but that they do this, they will dissolve the sands, the silts, the clays, the pebbles, all of those minerals that are in the soil. They will dissolve those into plant available forms. So if we have enough microbes in the soil that are alive and active and living, then we never need to buy all of the plant foods, you know, molybdenum, zinc, iron, copper, all that stuff. We never need to buy it and put on the land, because of the many soil tests that have been done around the world. Almost all soils, almost everywhere, have plenty of these things. What they're deficient in is the highest, like the higher populations of these mineralizers, the bacteria that will mineralize it. And then this takes us, so bacteria does other stuff, but we only have a few minutes here today. But fungus does the same thing, okay? They mineralize also. So your fungus and bacteria take the sand, silts, clays, and they give you your plant minerals, all of them. And so if your plants are showing a deficiency, you send a leaf analysis sap off to a test, and they say, "Oh yeah, your plant's not taking up this and this." I don't worry about getting the nutrient into the soil. I look at my microbes. I look at my compost. Am I growing the right numbers of microbes in that soil? And so the way you initially, like the first time you start with a field, how do you get those microbes there? You make a compost that has really high levels of all these populations of these guys. You get them in there. Once you get them there, you've got to keep them alive. So let's just do an analogy real quick. Let's say we want to be a cattle farmer. Now I'm going to get rich. Those ranchers out there, they're all rich. So that's supposed to be a joke. They are rich if they own land, but so I'm going to be rich. So I'm going to get all these cattle. And so you go out there and you get 500 acres, and you fill it with cattle, and then you leave for 9 months. And then you come back after 9 months, and you say, "Okay, go round up the cows, and we're going to sell them and be rich." There's not going to be any cattle there. They got out, or they died if you had really good fences and they couldn't get out. You have to actually take care of them. That is exactly the same with your microbes. So when you build your compost and you collect all these microbes from the environment, and then you harvest those microbes, meaning you take the compost and you make an extract, or you make a tea, or you just get the solid compost, because there's different ways to use it, which we're not going to get into today. But we put that onto the soil. You've inoculated the soil. Inoculate means to introduce. So we have introduced the microbes into the soil. And now what are we going to do? Say we're done? No, just like with the cattle. You got to feed them, you got to water them, you got to do things. So what do we do to keep those microbes alive? And that takes us back to the soil health principles. Okay? You got to be mindful. You got to have the right context. You got to keep that ground covered. You've got to have a living root in the soil all the time, and all of the other ones. But why the living root? The living root feeds the microbes. There's two things that feed microbes. One is the detritus sphere, and so that's what we're putting on the top of the soil. The dead, dying organic matter. Leaves fall off trees in the fall, right? And they're called leaves. So they come down and they hit the ground. And they're called leaves because you're supposed to leave them there. We're not supposed to rake them up, okay? So ecological speaking, that's the truth. Why? Why do we keep ground clean? Why do we have nice clean rows with one crop in each row? Because we've been taught that way. It's not because it's correct. It's, and I'm not pointing my finger at past generations and saying you're wrong. What I'm saying is, now that we know more, we probably should be doing things in a smarter way. So bacteria and fungus are your mineralizers. The bacteria eat the green plants. The fungus eats the woody stuff, the wood chips, the old dead plants. But can the bacteria and fungus, will they eat the same plant? Yes, absolutely. So if I have grass that's growing, and I mow it once a week, I always have these grass clippings that are green, fast-growing plants. The bacteria is what's going to decompose those. That's what the bacteria is eating. But if I let the grass grow, and it grows, and it grows, and it grows, and it's coming off the ground, and it comes up here, and it goes to seed, and this is like 4 months old by now, and it's turning yellow because fall is coming, and you've had your first frost, and now it's completely dead, but it's still standing there. And then a herd of cattle come through and they eat a whole bunch of it and then they knock a lot of it down. It's the same plant, but now it's fungus food. So in the early stages of green growth, bacteria eat it. In the late stages, once it's lignified and it has all those long carbon chains of the dead straw-looking material, now it's fungus food. Okay? Protozoa, what do they eat? They eat bacteria. When they eat the bacteria, they release what the bacteria is made of, which drives your nitrogen cycle. Nematodes, that's a 4-hour class right there. So just know that there's 5 groups. One group is the bad guy that eat your roots, but they only live in the bad soils, in the anaerobic soils. So if you're doing the soil health principles, remember their action words, so that's what you do, then you won't have the bad guys, because they don't live in that condition. They live in anaerobic compacted soil. So the other 4 are good ones. And they're going to eat bacteria, they're going to eat fungi, they're going to eat each other, and they're going to be releasing nutrients. So you want the beneficial nematodes. They're very important. And then microarthropods. So arthropods are bugs. Micro ones are so little you need a microscope. Macros are big ones. So that's all bugs. Okay? So all the creepy crawlies. So they rip, they shred. A lot of your micro arthropods are eating fungus, which is fantastic, because that's going to be releasing ammonium into the soil, which is a form of nitrogen that's driving that nitrogen cycle. And then, of course, you have enchytraeids and earthworms as well. And I could talk for years about earthworms, but I'm not going to. We have other experts about earthworms today. So, Gail, how much time have we got? Where are we at?
You're close to the end.
Okay. How much, we should go into questions maybe.
That's what I was thinking. If
Perfect.
we could wrap up in a couple minutes, we could go into questions.
Perfect. Questions? Raise your hand. Yes.
Okay, so I have a question. So, I'm on 5 acres. I'm trying to keep 3 of it as natural and native as possible.
Okay.
So when you talk about weeds, because in my garden area, right now, all I get rid of are those invasives, right?
Okay.
So after this snowpack, I have wonderful things happening. I've got wild onion, I've got biscuit root, I've got milk veg, lots of grasses, but I also have an overabundance of death. I don't know if they're camas or camas, death camas, whatever they are.
Yeah.
So those I'm getting rid of.
Okay.
Because I'm gonna have an animal that's gonna pasture back there in a couple weeks.
Sure.
And they go to flower, they go to seed, right, and then you get more and more and more. So those I am like getting rid of them. So when you talk about not getting rid of weeds, I also have a high abundance of red stem fillery, which drives me crazy. So do you just leave it? But the red stem fillery is hard because it's flat to the ground, and once it flowers, I mean, oh my goodness, it's. So I understand the point of keeping it. I also understand, but. And I'm assuming you don't have death comments in your greenhouse.
No,
But,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so here's the thing. You're talking about the soil health principle of context,
Right.
okay? For somebody else in here, they would have a different context. You said you're gonna have an animal grazing. You obviously don't want toxic plants in there, okay? You don't wanna leave a bunch of car batteries out there for them to get lead poisoning and die. So they would be, if you're gonna have livestock, you need to keep them healthy. So yeah, try to eradicate your noxious weeds. That's a good idea. For somebody else who's doing a botanical garden of all the plants that are filled with alkaloids, then they would want as many of the bad plants as they could get. So context matters. So yeah. So I don't think that really answers what you were asking, but
Well, I'm just trying to keep it as native and natural as possible. I do not want to clear it. I just kind of want to leave it be, but promote, it to be as healthy as possible.
Yeah.
There's only a horse out there.
Yeah,
maybe
so,
2 months in
yeah.
a year for pasturing, and that's pretty much it. Other than that, it's left alone.
yeah, perfect. I do have one more comment about that. Since your goal is to have it be native and beautiful, just go see what plants are native to your area that aren't there, and then start introducing them in mass.
Yeah, I'm looking at another area
So-
trying to build up the grasses again.
Yeah,
Because
that's-
Simon been, there
yeah,
was
that's-
red grasses and now they're almost all gone. I
Yeah.
don't know why, but.
Yeah. Well, the number one thing that kills grass in grasslands, and this is a whole nother class, but since you're asking, the number one thing, the quickest way to desertify a piece of land is to remove all animals. And we can see that was proven in the national parks in the West, like Canyonlands, Arches, they used to be grasslands. They weren't huge grasslands because it's low rainfall, but they were grasslands. And then when they reached national park status, the grass is no longer there. So that's the quickest way. The second quickest way is to overgraze it. And so the ranchers and cowboys always get blamed for overgrazing, which is true. If we overgraze, that creates a grassland. I mean, a desert too, but it doesn't do it as quick when you keep the livestock there. The quickest way to bring the grass back is to manage your grazing properly, where you will bring in and you will graze the grass just right, and then you move the grazers off, and then you have plenty of rest before they come back. Sometimes that's 6 months, sometimes it's 6 years. In fact, that's an exaggeration. I've never seen it 6 years. Maybe 2 years is more correct. So if you want to build the grasses, you've got to have the grazers. So, but you can't overgraze it. Are we done? You have a question?
Well, I just have a comment, because I think what I got from your presentation, William, is you're saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. Like, you've got a good system with compost that's really helping keep your soil alive. You're allowing some of the weeds to stay because you want to make sure that there's one variety. And so, yeah, you've got a few pests, but you're not overwhelmed with pests, and you're producing good food, and you're feeding people, and that's what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Make compost and inoculate your prairie. But don't buy compost from far away, because it'll have the microbes that will do the thing in the soil far away. That's the same problem with our seeds. Most garden seeds today are produced in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. How many of us share a climate with the Willamette Valley of Oregon where they get hundreds of inches of rain every year and perfect growing season from the 1st of June until mid-September? So let's not buy our seeds from catalogs anymore. Where are you going to get them?
That's a whole seed.
That's a whole nother
conversation.
class, sorry.
That's an end now.
But,
months of
yeah.
possession now.
Okay,
Any other questions for William?
any more? Apparently we have time for a question.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thanks, William.
I do have one other thing to say. I do have to leave because I have a lot of farm tours, and so I'm sorry, because I wanted to hear your other presentations, but thank you.
Thank you for making the time to be with us.